Show presents Scratch a Track,
the podcast where we debate which track to scratch off some of the most known and unknown albums of all time.
We live in an era of singles.
This is an album.
People no longer listen to an album for the work it truly is.
It kind of defines a band.
It's just not something that people relate to nowadays.
We've all gotten the dreaded.
It started out as a game.
Which track on the album would you scratch out if you had to? All right, everyone. Welcome to Scratch a Track, presented by the Dude and Grim Show. We really want to start this off by giving you a little background about what this podcast is going to be. Both Grim and myself, we are huge fans of music, but we're also really, in particular, huge fans of albums. And so I think the first thing, Grim, I would just want to ask you is, what is it about an album that really resonates with you? Like, when's like the first time you were like, oh, this is an album, and that really kind of stuck with you and whatnot?
Well, the first time, I guess for me, was listening to The Wall. My dad had the record of it, but the bigger question of what is an album, I think an album is a complete work of art, and it's presented in a certain way because that's the way the artist intended it to be listened to. And nowadays, unfortunately, we kind of live in a time where we're concerned about singles and we don't have the attention span to even devote enough time to an album to listen to it. Most streaming services, if you select the first song on an album, you'll find that it is automatically on shuffle mode because it's just not something that, unfortunately, people relate to nowadays. And that's kind of what brought us to this idea for the podcast. It started out as a game.
Yeah, and right, totally. And I think for me, something kind of where an album has meant something to me is, it kind of defines a band at a point in their career, and you can sort of see with certain bands, you see the evolution of their music and their sound, and the bands change over time. The people change, the technology changes, and also the world itself changes. And so there's a lot of factors and influences that really define kind of an album as hitting a certain time and place. So essentially what we're going to, I think, talk about in this podcast is we're going to go through and we're going to talk about a lot of these popular classic albums that a lot of people have been familiar with throughout their lifetime. And also, though, we want to talk about some other albums that maybe people aren't as familiar with. And I don't think either of us intend it to be a critique per se, but rather more a discussion of the album and ultimately ask each other the question of which track or song on the album would you scratch out if you had to. And this is if people like us and our generation and our parents' generation, we had CDs and we had vinyl albums, and vinyl albums are making a comeback, and we've all gotten the dreaded tick 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 sound on your CD, and you're like, why did it have to happen like at that song? Why couldn't it be this song? And I think that's kind of the game that we've played over the years, and kind of what we want to talk about and discuss within this podcast.
Yeah, it makes for a fun game, and it makes for a lot of interesting discussion as to why and what about a song or something moves the listener.
Exactly. And so I guess if I had to ask you real quick, what kind of criteria are you going to be using to decide like, oh, which song is this going to be? Is it going to be the hot popular radio track that you've heard a billion times, or maybe it's just like a song that, hey, this doesn't do it for me, or I don't like the intro? I mean, what sort of criteria are you going to use?
Yeah, good question. And I don't have a single piece of criteria. I think it's kind of all over the board, and a lot of it really depends on the album itself, because there could be examples where the radio track that you've heard a million times, you would want to hear a million more times because it's that good. Or there's just something that strikes you as dull or too slow or just kind of boring.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
and some of it, I guess, is for me on like a musical level too. There's some things that musically just don't really grab me the right way.
Sure. All right. Well, hopefully that kind of gives everybody an idea of what this show and podcast is going to be about. That's not to say that it won't change, it won't evolve, or something like that. But I think it's a really good starting point, and kind of like you said, it's a good thing for discussion for people to debate about, because even the times where you and I have played it, you'll say one song and I'm like, oh my God, I love that song,
Yeah.
and vice versa. So. I think that just gives everyone a good roadmap of what we're trying to do here and talk about. So we're happy you're here. Please subscribe, and we think you'll find this really interesting, and can't wait to talk some albums.
Scratch a Track is produced by the Dude and Grim. Additional music provided by More. That's ... MORE, and the Tims, TIMNZ. Copyright 2020, The Dude and Grim Show.